at Northwestern today. He is the author of 7 books, including The Betting the Earth, How We Can Still Win the Biggest Gamble of All Time. This book is the only one to be endorsed by Harvard, Duke, and Notre Dame professors, a United States congressman, and by famed poker pro Barry Greenstein. Professor Kunich recently served as Fulbright Senior Specialist at the Indian Law Institute in New Delhi, India. In addition to his books on environmental law, he is the author of Cupspan's Leadership Secrets, Learning to Win from a Cursed Team's Errors. We are also very grateful for Professor David Dana to offer to present a debate to us today. Professor Dana is a leading scholar in the fields of environmental, property, intellectual property, and professional responsibility law. Prior to joining Northwestern, Professor Dana taught as Associate Professor of Law at Boston University of Law from 1993 to 1998. His articles have been published in numerous leading law journals, most recently in UCLA, Journal of Environmental Law and Policy, Fordham Environmental Law Review, and University of Chicago Law Review. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Professor Dana, for taking the time from your busy schedule to do this. It's my honor to be at Northwestern. This is actually where I took the bar exam way back in the Precambrian era, so I have very bad memories of this place. But it turned out okay. That's all right. Well, basically, we're going to talk a little bit about free market environmentalism. Can it make a difference? Can it help with some of the biggest environmental challenges of all time? That's the thesis of my latest instant non-bestseller, Betting the Earth. And basically, in that book, I look at the 2 huge environmental issues of our day, at least in my opinion: climate change / global warming, and mass extinction, biodiversity loss. I think those are the 2 really immense environmental issues that face us. And my thesis is simply that on these 2 hugely important issues, we are making terrible decisions, both internationally and domestically, mostly because of our failure to grasp the nature of the threat and to come up with a proactive approach to these very difficult, gradual, slow-acting, subtle problems. Command and control regulation, I think, has a place. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not going to be an extra in the upcoming film series Atlas Shrugged or anything like that. I don't propose to supplant governmental regulation of environmental law, just to supplement it. I think there should be a greater component of inducements, incentives, carrots as well as sticks. And I think especially when we have to deal with problems like climate change, like mass extinction, that's especially important. These problems are of a type that we have proved again and again we're singularly ill-equipped to deal with them. How did we get to this point? Well, basically, human beings evolved in response to very different kinds of challenges, very different from these gradual challenges. We evolved dodging things like lions leaping out of the bush from us. You don't have a lot of time for rumination and nuanced focus group study when something like that happens. Instantaneously, you have to make a decision. Flight or fight. What do we do about that lion charging? Does she just want to give me a big hug, or is she looking to eat me for lunch? You don't have a lot of time to study those, and so to the extent we're good at any kind of solving of problems, it's that kind that we're predisposed to handle. You look at the major environmental laws in this country, the vast majority of them were enacted in the immediate aftermath of some major crisis. A big publicity scandal dealing with things like 3 Mile Island, Love Canal, the loss of our national symbol, the bald eagle. Something like that happens, film at 11, people get up in arms, they start demanding that Congress take action, and Congress will pass a law in response to those kinds of relatively fast-moving, dramatic crises. May not be the best law, may not be a good law, but they will take some action. But what happens when you have a different kind of challenge, a subtle, nuanced, slow-moving event like climate change or the mass extinction? We tend to ignore them. We don't see them. No one pretty much is agitating for political action. There are very few people lobbying Congress for these kinds of problems. And as a result, pretty much nothing gets done. And that's true internationally as well as domestically. It's a matter of dealing with subtle, nuanced, question-ridden issues, not the kind of thing we excel at doing. Even mass extinction, the previous 5 mass extinctions before this one, we weren't involved. The one that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, I can tell you, I was in middle school at the time. I saw the giant meteor, twice the size of Mount Everest. It came crashing into Earth at 40,000 miles an hour. Wow, you know what? Oh, snap. That's one of those film at 11 type events. But even then, giant meteor strike, the ultimate crisis. Most of those species went extinct over the next 2,000 years. Now, the ones that were in the immediate vicinity of the impact zone, yes, they were wiped out instantly, but the vast majority went out of existence over the next many centuries because of the climate change and other systemic changes that were brought about by that initial impact. And it looked very subtle over the ensuing centuries as the species gradually dwindled. Climate change, well, if you look at the hockey stick graph that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has published, many centuries, roughly in a narrow range of average temperatures, and then the last century or so, it trends upward about 1 degree centigrade, and no one really knows how long that upward trend will continue. Is it just a momentary spike that will go back down? Will it continue? Will it worsen? No one knows for sure. Pretty clear that there is a link between anthropogenic generation of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and others that increases the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere because of what we do, and that will, all else being equal, cause an increase in the planet's temperature. Not the same everywhere, not always in a linear pattern, but it will tend to increase the temperature and disrupt climate patterns, cause increase in severe weather, etc. But exactly how much time we have to say yes or no on major intervention, exactly how bad it will be, how fast we'll get there, and what it will take, if anything, to turn this around, no one knows that for sure. Even if we pretend we do, there are major question marks. So on issues like these, What happens? What do we do? Is there a way of making decisions that are very momentous, but the issues are complex, nuanced, slow-acting, and riddled with some major question marks? I think government has done a very poor job of dealing with them, i.e. they've mostly kicked the can down the road on them, right? We have nothing, either internationally or domestically, that singles out the key ecosystems and habitats of the world, the biodiversity hotspots, or any other priority-ranked system of identifying and preserving the key, most important habitats. We have Endangered Species Acts, we have acts that are focused on certain categories of species, but not on the key habitats. We've done nothing systemically, either internationally or domestically, to solve that problem. Mostly one at a time, we single out species that we either identify with, we like them, we name our sports teams after them, or there's some reason to have an affinity for them. Climate change, well, in this country, famously, we've got no statute on the books. There was the Waxman-Markey bill that was working its way through Congress in the previous Congress, but it never was enacted into law. And it's extremely unlikely anything's going to be enacted in the current Congress, given the results of the November elections. Internationally, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the umbrella treaty under which the Kyoto Protocol was enacted. Of course, the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and even the protocol itself is set to expire at the end of 2012, less than 2 years away. And the last two conferences of the parties under the Framework Convention have ended with no successor protocol being agreed upon. So right now, nothing is set to replace Kyoto when it expires at the end of 2012. So really, we're doing very little on either of these hugely important issues. Is there a better way? I think not that big business or a free market approach is a panacea to the problem, but at least by supplementing the governmental approach with some inducements, we might turn loose the engines of creativity and innovation. I think it's more likely if we have a flexible approach to the problem that we'll come up with something rather than by government fiat. And in Betting the Earth, I look at some of the greatest thinkers of all time who have dealt with uncertainty, decision-making in an atmosphere of doubt, fog, like Blaise Pascal. And I'll just talk briefly about Blaise and then I'll sit down. Blaise Pascal, I'm sure most of you have heard of him. A great name for a pitcher, wouldn't it? Oh, pitching for the Cubs, Blaise Pascal. It would have had ungodly breaking stuff, wicked fast. Unfortunately, he lived in the 1600s, but if he had known his name was so perfect for a pitcher, he would have invented baseball. Real genius. But his most important, most famous contribution was something he never really finished. It was just something he was working on as a tool to help him with some other project, and that's Pascal's Wager. Boiled down to its essence, it's a way of making momentous, even life or death decisions when you have at least one and maybe several factors that are relevant to that decision that you don't know what the value is. You don't know. Is it good or is it bad? It's like a cosmic game of deal or no deal, right? There's Howie, he's got the banker on the phone. All right, you want this briefcase or this one? One of them has $1 million, the other one has 1 penny. Oh, they look the same to me. Well, you've got to pick. Okay. But it's worse than deal or no deal. It's worse than that. It's like the lady or the tiger. You've got 2 doors here. Behind one of them, the love of your life, an eternity of happiness. Behind the other one, man-eating tiger. Gonna have you for lunch. Which door should we open? Oh, I don't want to play. Well, you've got to. Pascal's genius was sometimes we were forced to play these very cruel, unfair games where you have to make a hugely important decision and you don't know at least one important variable. And it's even worse than that. When we're talking about the fate of the planet, we have to decide, what do we do about climate change? Is it bogus? Is it just a minor blip? Or is it really a potentially catastrophic thing that requires massive intervention? Every day that goes by that we don't make a decision to intervene is really a decision. It's a decision that today we're not going to do anything. That could be all right. It could be catastrophic. We don't know. And we don't know how much time we have to continue doing what we've been doing, i.e. pretty much nothing. Same thing with mass extinction. Every day that goes by without comprehensive systemic protection for the key hotspots of the world is the day that we decide it's not worth our trouble. We've got other things to worry about. We have innumerable wars and other conflicts to marshal, and we're not going to worry about the biodiversity of the world. how do we deal with those question marks? Pascal's insight was, take all of the variables, there might just be one, there might be several, for each one do a best case and a worst case analysis. This sounds commonplace to us, but it was an innovation in his day. Look at the best it could be if you were able to know the truth, which you can't, and look at the very worst it could be. And then for each of those polar outcomes, look at your choices. Just make it simple. I know there's a whole range of options. It might just say we vote yes or we vote no. We have major intervention or we do what we've been doing, i.e. nothing. And then you see, based on all the permutations and combinations of the values that these variables could take, what would happen if you vote yes? And what would happen if you vote no? If you have the best case and the worst case of each of the variables. Pascal showed that sometimes when you do this analysis and you look at the outcomes, you can put together a decision matrix that systematically lays out all the permutations and combinations. You see that maybe if you vote yes, you have more to gain and less to lose, based on all the ways the facts could sort out. And if you vote no, you have less to gain but more to lose. If that's the case, then reason and logic and probabilities would tend to steer you towards a yes vote, all else being equal. Doesn't mean you have to pick that option, but it helps you to make your decision rationally by doing this kind of analysis. So I've come up with variations of Pascal's Wager. I stole from the best, at least give me credit for that. And I've done a variation of Pascal's Wager for the biodiversity hotspots, the mass extinction wager, and I've done one for climate change, global warming. What's the best and worst could happen with each of the variables involved in both of those? And I boiled down the variables to 3 on each of them. I had to work very hard to narrow it down to just 3 question marks for both of them. If you have more than 3 variables, you can still do the analysis, but it gets to be unwieldy. The decision matrix becomes quite convoluted and massive. So I worked hard to boil it down to 3. And that helps, I think, to see what do we have to risk, what would it cost to intervene, how do the probabilities sort out, and what's the best and the worst that could happen. This, I think, at least supplements our usual approach to environmental decision making. And I think if the government would at least make some room for private industry to have some role in this, to get the government out of the way to some extent and allow this type of more free-form yet rational decision making, we would do better than what we have done. And you notice I'm setting the bar rather low for myself here. I'm not saying it would be the end of all our problems. It would just be better than what we have done. And that's not saying a whole lot, because as I've written in now 2 instant non-bestsellers, we've done zilch to forestall the 6th mass extinction of all time. Not hard to do a little bit better than nothing, right? And so I think this is a modest proposal. We've done so poorly with the biggest issues that ever faced our planet. We need to get all hands on deck. We need to do better. If we add these tools, if we add sophisticated decision analysis to the usual way government tackles these problems, it could at least help. And we need to look at this to see if perhaps there's a better way than what we have been doing. So I'll turn the time over to Professor Dana.
And I'm sorry for having to change the schedule. We have 150 judges out there, so I'm supposed to talk to them about something later. This is really interesting, and I actually am pretty sympathetic to a lot of what John said. I guess I come from it having talked to a lot of climate scientists who don't think there's so much uncertainty, although there is variation in opinion. And certainly economists have more views of different uncertainty, but it's not clear, at least, that there's so much uncertainty, and it's not clear that we can't really know that we're in pretty big trouble unless we take dramatic action. So I guess I come from that, and that may put a difference on how one approaches the different possibilities. On the rest of it, though, I'm in a lot of agreement. Clearly, we're doing nothing. And actually, it's kind of worse than what John said, which is the government actually subsidizes a lot of activities that exacerbate climate change, even though we all know better. So the state of Florida, for example, one of the reasons houses get blown down all the time in Florida, I don't know it's Florida, maybe is because of climate change. It's certainly possible. Insurers sort of think so, and they've canceled private insurance, but then the state is now subsidizing insurance for rebuilding houses on the coast and for coastal development. And a lot of that is bad from both a perspective of adapting to climate change and preventing it. So I think there is room to get around the government policy, but I don't really know that there's a simple way to kind of get government out of the picture, because government, collectively, we have to do something that creates incentives for private actors to act and to innovate and to sort of reduce emissions, and that requires a legal structure. And so in some sense, you can't get around the political deadlock of how do you get a legal structure, even if you think there's a different mechanism. And so one thing I'm interested in, and by the way, he wrote a book about the Cubs too, so he's very eclectic, so you could also ask other questions of more interest. But I think a carbon tax, although it's politically dead in the water, in some ways is the most elegant market solution, because I agree it's not clear for political and informational reasons that you want central government picking the choice, because you may be able to pick clean coal, and that's not really a good choice, or pick nuclear, and maybe that's a good choice, but maybe if it's not, maybe it'll be reflecting political things. But a carbon tax essentially puts a price on emissions that lead to climate change. I know it's cold out, so it's hard to think about climate change, except in a positive way, thinking it gets warmer. But basically, and a carbon tax is a kind of market-freeing mechanism, because it creates an incentive for businesses to figure out ways to avoid carbon emissions, because now there's a price on those carbon emissions. They're not free. So set at a reasonably high graduated rate. It strikes me that that's the most elegant way to try to bring business and industry in, and at least theoretically, maybe it avoids a lot of the political failures that we've had. And but that still brings us back to the politics question, which is, that probably you can only get a few people in Congress, and they all have bodyguards to say they would support a carbon tax, and even a modest one. And in the United States, we don't really have a federal gasoline tax, which would be a kind of sort of straightforward carbon tax. And even when the price of gasoline goes up and down, and when it goes down, still the idea of putting a tax on it, is considered politically unacceptable. So it strikes me that's probably the best way to kind of energize the market rather than have specific government actions. The only other thing I'd say, and I thought this one about Pascal was really interesting, and he did other things in math, right? I remember high school. Okay, I don't remember what it was. But I kept thinking it's the Pythagorean theorem, but then I thought that's Pythagoras, right? So anyways, so see what I knew. Anyway, that's where I went to law. But I think we have some good solutions that have been out there, but I think politically they've been not viable. So I don't know whether decision analysis can help. The other thing I think is hard about decision analysis here is we can't really assign probabilities, although I do think there's more of a significant probability of catastrophic harms. And I think it's harder ultimately to do decision analysis when you're talking about a kind of Pascalian approach, which is very rationalized and orderly and French. It is. The French mathematicians, very nice lines. When you're talking about problems that are incredibly complicated and sort of swirling around a complex system. So I don't know about that. But I do think we need to sort of harness the market, but we have to get Congress first. So,
Okay, very good comments. Just as a brief rejoinder, I would say that when you're making these decisions, deciding to use a form of analysis like this, I think there's virtually no chance that Congress will do it. I mean, they do things the way they've always done them, and let's face it, usually they act when they think it's in their self-interest to act. They fear they won't be reelected, etc. But I think the bottom line of why I wrote this latest book is that I think that we need to have a grassroots movement. That's really what generated most of our environmental laws in this country, when the electorate became energized about an environmental problem and basically demanded that Congress take action. What can you do when Congress is focused on putting out fires all the time? Our usual approach to decision making is the opposite of proactive. It's very reactive, very crisis-oriented. Your new mayor, Rahm Emanuel, famously says, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, that's the politician's credo, right? When there's a crisis, we'll piggyback on it, and we'll use it to ram through some legislation we've been keeping in our back pocket. Now's our chance, right? Well, you need to take advantage of that, or at least be cognizant of that, and use that to steer the debate. Right now, most people probably couldn't care less about climate change or the loss of species, because they've got many things that are impacting their lives on an everyday, very real basis that provide real world concerns in the here and now. I mean, we're talking about today. Am I ever going to get a job again? How am I going to pay for insurance? What is the insurance system going to look like? Are we going to be at war forever with maybe 60% of the world? All these concerns. I mean, these are things that people say, oh my God, what are we going to do? And you say, well, we're in a mass extinction right now. They say, oh, better off without them. There's more for the rest of us. And who cares? No, and that's what happens. You know, these things that may ultimately be hugely important just by default get ignored. You can't tell people who are out of work and fearing that their son or daughter is going to go off and get killed somewhere else in the world in some war that maybe 5 centuries from now there's going to be a new global medical threat, a new plague, a new version of AIDS, that perhaps some species that we're letting or driving into extinction would have been the cure for that, but because it's died out, we have no cure and we're all dead. I say, well, geez, we'll all be dead by then. Who cares what happens in 500 years? You know, people don't have that kind of long-term perspective. And that's a real tragedy. We don't take the long-term view. We insist that all our crises be immediate. We think of climate change like it was depicted in the movie Day After Tomorrow, where you can actually see the new ice age chasing you down the hall, and you outrun that sucker and close the door to the library before it freeze dries you in your tracks. No! That's not how climate change works. No! But people think it is, and when they don't see that, it's just garbage. It's not real. We've got other stuff to worry about. Well, yes, we do. We always have other stuff to worry about. But sometimes somebody has to take a long-term view as well as putting out the fires du jour. And if we don't, we have to be lucky, right? We're basically jamming all our chips to the middle of the table. We're pushing all in, and we're not looking at our cards first. And I may not be much of a poker player, but I at least look at my cards before I jam. It's just one of my many quirks. We're not doing that. We're shoving all in, saying, we're betting that climate change is nothing to worry about. We're betting that the mass extinction isn't real or it's not going to deprive us of the cure for the next plague that's going to wipe us out 300 years from now. But boy, you better be right when you take bets like that. That is talking high stakes, right? That's high stakes poker. And I live in fear, because I'm a paranoid guy, I live in fear that we're going to be proved wrong, and maybe we'll all be dead by the time that happens. But don't we owe something intergenerationally to the generations of the future to make these kinds of hard calls, to look down the road more than the short-term perspective? We haven't done that. We've never really done it, right? But it's time to change, and I have no illusions that my generation is going to be the cure to this. And we've done an excellent job of messing things up and dithering and wasting time while all these problems continue to go unabated. I think it's going to be you, the next generation of leaders from great law schools like this one. You'll have the chance to turn this debate around and make a real difference. As cliched as that sounds, somebody's got to do it, and it hasn't been my generation. So that's enough preaching for now, and I see Professor Dana has escaped, so I'm free to say pretty much anything I want. So I'm going to just sit down. Well, I'm going to shut up now and let you ask some questions or make some comments, and I'll do my best to respond. Sir.
So, I'm with you on all what you're preaching, as you put it.
Amen, brother.
Amen. So now what's the free market portion?
Yeah, the free market.
Solution?
The free market is, and I said it's not really to supplant, but just to supplement what we've got. A balanced diet of carrots and sticks. And really, my main problem is that the government's doing more harm than good with their subsidies. In theory, subsidies could be wonderful if the government would subsidize the right things, right? But they have a bad track record of picking winners in these horse races. They subsidize things like ethanol, clean coal, biomass. You know, let's grow a lot of food, and instead of feeding it to starving kids, we'll turn it into gasoline. Only the government could come up with something that stupid, right? And when they do, throw in huge amounts of money at subsidies for those favored industries, it skews the playing field. It steers bright scientists and researchers away from just looking at the best possible solution. They go out and grab the grant money. And it's a reasonable thing to do. Here's a ready supply of money if you do research in these favored areas. If they would just fund basic research, I would be much happier. That would create much more opportunities for somebody out there to get lucky. And frankly, that's how we got most of our really big breakthroughs. It's serendipity. It's a combination of genius and a lucky break here or there. We're tilting the playing field towards a few favored narrow industries and decreasing our odds of basically getting lucky. Sir?
So what I hear you to be saying is that the government has picked the wrong winners.
Yes.
And that the incentives are misaligned right now.
Right.
And your solution to that is to fund only basic research so that the winners can out themselves through market processes.
I would say basically yes, basic research. And I mean, this always devolves into sort of parody, but you know, the space program back in the day, we got a lot of benefits from that, whatever you think of the value of getting to the moon, right? All sorts of inventions and breakthroughs came from that, largely through funding the basic research across a whole spectrum of fields that was necessary to put people on the moon. And much of it will go nowhere. I have no doubt, you know, that's the way research works. But at least by funding broadly, you increase the chances that somebody is going to combine genius with luck and have the breakthrough.
May I follow up?
Sure.
So what would be your response to the argument that we just need to pick better winners that are more obviously aligned with reducing carbon emissions, such as a carbon tax?
Now, that would be great if government displayed any propensity to do that correctly or with a good track record, but I mean, you know what happens when government makes decisions and picks industries to favor.
I know what happens when they do it badly, yes.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what they do, right? They pick industries that either are heavy campaign contributors, you know, they funded the politician's re-election, they're entrenched, they have a large constituency that already works in that field, like coal or oil, and it skews the whole debate. You know, politicians by nature are political animals, and they tend to watch out for their own narrow interests. They don't objectively look at all the facts and say, well, let's get some scientists together, we'll figure out what's fundamentally the optimal strategy. They just don't do that very well.
So why isn't the solution institutional reform, where you could actually have a pretty broad-based movement towards it? So I mean, you have a government that's less interested in status quo bias, which the current American government is structured to be, especially with the filibuster. Or you have a movement towards improved campaign financing, so it's harder for special interests to make themselves the winners. Like why isn't that the focus instead of this? The way it's described right now is a pretty vague movement towards free market solutions.
I'd be happy to see any of those initiatives succeed, but I have a very high opinion of human ingenuity when it comes to political self-interest. No matter what you do in the way of campaign finance reform, people who are professional politicians will find a way of gaming the system. I have no doubt of that. I may not know what it's going to be. They will figure it out. I don't think you can excise self-interest from politics. It's just fundamental to the nature of the enterprise. So I realize there will always be elected officials and political figures and government involvement. I just think we need to supplement it with something that's not quite so tied to the campaign to get reelected and to draw contributions for the war chest.
Can I follow up?
We'll maybe get back to you in a little bit, but somebody else.
What's your feeling on cap and trade?
Cap and trade can work, and it has worked with Title IV of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 on acid rain. And there, we have significantly improved the situation with regard to acid rain, largely caused by sulfur and nitrogen oxides in the air. But the problem with cap and trade is assigning the authorizations to emit. You have two major ways of doing that. Either based on a historical baseline, government says, based on what you emitted, industry by industry, even plant by plant, as of a certain baseline year, you have a right to emit like 90% of that starting 3 years from now. That rewards people who have been profligate up to that point. It rewards those who have done nothing to already make improvements. It rewards those who have done nothing and say, well, we'll just pollute to our heart's content, and then they make out like bandits. Once the cap and trade system gets enacted, it's very easy to take the low-hanging fruit, make some relatively cheap, dramatic reductions, which is good. Reductions are what we're after. But then they sell the excess allotments to others and make huge windfall profits. That rewards those who have been very dirty in the past. The other way is an auction system where you auction off the right to emit, and that's fine, I suppose, except it favors the wealthy and powerful, and it disfavors the little guy, the smaller industries, who, if they need an authorization to emit greenhouse gases, where are they going to get it? You know, the farmers, the ranchers, who, if we start regulating carbon dioxide and methane as regulated pollutants under the Clean Air Act, they're going to need to have permits too.
But wouldn't the market come to an efficient price?
Yeah, but it may be beyond the limits of what this little guy has to spend.
Sure.
Yeah.
That could always be the case.
And maybe that's, in the long run, maybe that's a good solution, because it will drive out of business a certain number of sources of the pollutant at a rather dear cost in human tragedy for all these people who now are ruined. But maybe, you know, sometimes you do have to take one for the team. That's the hard call that's tied up with cap and trade. How do you set the caps? And it tends to reward perversely. I agree it can work, it's a partial solution, but there are some political minefields that have to be a matter of concern too. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think that in order for a free market approach to climate change to be viable, don't you think it needs to be an international effort? Because it would just drive businesses out, from being, based out of the United States into other, like China.
Yes, exactly right. It does, because after all, climate change is a global problem, hence the term global warming. No nation can do it unilaterally. Even if we completely eliminated all of our anthropogenic emissions of GHGs, that's only about 17% of the global total of anthropogenic GHGs. Not enough to turn around the climate. China has slightly more of a share than we do. Many other nations have significant shares of the global total of GHGs. India, Brazil, Indonesia, Philippines, etc. And so if you don't have a lot of international cooperation, you can't hope to actually get to the reason for the action, lowering the global concentrations of these gases. The key, though, is how do you get that kind of cooperation? How do you get nations of the world that are in very different situations economically, in terms of their social stability, their form of government, to cooperate on something like this? You know, the Kyoto Protocol divided its signatories into Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. It was only the Annex 1 nations, like the United States, that had to make meaningful reductions in their emissions. Many nations signed on mostly because it was a freebie. They didn't have to do much of anything. When that changes, and when we ask every signatory to make real sacrifices, you're not going to be able to get the signature. That's why the last two COPs have ended in failure. The only way it's going to work, I think, is either if the evidence is so dramatic that we realize, my God, this is an imminent crisis and this is the only chance we have, i.e. an Independence Day type scenario. That's the only time I ever remember when the nations of the world all united. Oh, enemy warships from space hovering over our capitals, blasting the hell out of us. Okay, that's bad, let's do something. Or we find a way to do well by doing good. A painless way of reducing our GHGs. A breakthrough that allows us to actually make more money while eliminating our GHGs. Some breakthrough where, whether it's cold fusion or hydrogen or some more economically viable form of solar or wind or something else, becomes the solution. Oh, we can do much better. We can get rid of our reliance on these fossil fuels that are dwindling away anyhow, and we can actually make more money by switching over. You know, I think realistically it's going to be one or the other, and the problem with the Independence Day scenario is by the time it gets to be that severe, it's usually too late to do anything. By the time a crisis like mass extinction or climate change gets to that level, the tipping point has already been passed, and all you can do is pick up the pieces. We need to get ahead of the power curve. So my real hope, and no one's ever confused me of an optimist except, well, I am a lifelong Cubs fan, and I still am after a century plus of failure. But other than that, I'm not optimistic that we're going to make the hard sacrifices necessary to turn around these issues. We'll only do it if we can do it either relatively painlessly or even better, we can make out like bandits while doing it. But somebody's got to come up with that innovation. Let's see.
You're pretty cynical about political self-interest.
Yes.
And I share that cynicism, but I also have the same cynicism about economic self-interest.
Right.
And I tend to think, I guess to keep this short, in the past we've had a pretty bad history with the economy around inventing alternative solutions. You know, the oil industry has bought up patents and pocketed them.
Yeah.
And I hope there isn't anybody that even argues with that. A hybrid car, for example, existed as an invention years and years before it came out.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are other things that exist
Yeah.
that are completely hidden. And so I guess my question is, if government got out of the way,
Yeah.
or even started funding basic research, you know, to fund basic research enough to compete with the oil companies and the coal companies would be more than the government's ever going to spend on that sort of thing. So.
Well, those are good points, and the problem is, you're right, the fossil fuel industries like oil and coal are very wealthy right now and have a lot of power, political power and economic power. At some point, as the supply dwindles, and after all, it is non-renewable, we are going to run out at some point, the supply will dwindle to the extent that it becomes economically unviable anymore. Oil or gas will become so expensive that alternatives to it will now be able to compete fairly in the open market without the need for government to insist that we use X% of solar or wind, etc. Until you reach that point, it's really hard to overcome the advantage that these economic giants have. And I'm certainly not a shill for Wall Street or big business or these fossil fuel industries. They are indeed part of the problem, and governments help keep them there. They've been subsidized heavily too, just like the railroads were in the 19th century. We needed them, so government got in bed with them and helped them to get powerful and has helped them to stay in power. So there's plenty of blame to go around. And in terms of their ability to buy up patents and things like that, I think it's despicable, it's a horrible thing. My only hope, and this is going to sound really crazy, but you've come to expect that from me in the short time we've known each other, it's going to take somebody who's certifiably insane in most of major life areas, like Kurt Gödel, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. But in one area, they're a genius. And they don't care about money. They don't want to sell their patents. They don't care about anything but their passion. I've invented a new form of renewable clean energy, and they're going to make it available for free to the world. Somebody like, and in my book I write about Gödel as well with the incompleteness theorems. Somebody like that who was nuts enough to starve to death when his wife died because she was the only one he trusted to taste his food for him. Crazy, but the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. Somebody like that can come up with a breakthrough of energy and tell the oil companies to go to hell if they want to buy up his patent. It might take something like that. Doesn't happen very often, I'll grant you that, but once in a while it does. And they have a better track record. And this is a sad commentary. Crazy crackpots have a better track record than either big business or big government at solving our major fundamental problems. Thank you, big business, thank you, government. But it's true, yes. Let's see, somebody who hasn't already had a chance. Yes, sir?
You mentioned providing a system to supplement the current regulation. What then are your thoughts on proposed legislation to eliminate or to remove the authorization, or to remove the authority of EPA to regulate greenhouse gases?
Well, that's a great question. That, of course, arises under the 2007 decision, Massachusetts v. EPA. I'm sure you've already read that case in several different courses, but in case you haven't, basically, Supreme Court, based on some litigation before it, ruled that EPA had to evaluate greenhouse gases for regulation under the Clean Air Act. EPA did, and they issued two determinations. The endangerment finding that indeed greenhouse gases do endanger human health or the environment by contributing to climate change, etc., and human-based generation of these GHGs causes or contributes to this endangerment. The combination of those means that EPA must regulate them under the Clean Air Act. And Congress basically is scurrying about trying to figure out what to do about this. And some proposals are indeed to strip EPA of the authority to do this, basically to legislatively overturn Mass v. EPA. I hate to see that be the outcome, although I wouldn't be surprised if it were. I think that's the way Congress usually responds to something like this. They say, oh, we don't like this outcome. We don't like having EPA have that much power over our industries, that they can regulate carbon dioxide and methane as greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act and subject them to the need to get permits and new source performance reviews, etc. So we'll just overturn the case. We'll deprive EPA of that authority. That's like saying we're going to turn back time and act like Mass v. EPA never happened. A better option would be Congress takes a look at this and says, all right, we don't want to just leave it like it is. We need to actually either amend the Clean Air Act or pass standalone legislation that tackles the problem directly and in a commonsensical, workable way. And then we can overturn Mass v. EPA and say, here's our solution to it. That would be a more reasoned, proactive approach. Will it be more likely that Congress goes that way than just repealing or overturning Mass v. EPA? I am not so sure. I would hate to see them take the relatively easy way out and just say, well, we're going to overturn the decision. It's a hugely important case. I think it's the most important Supreme Court decision of the last 30 years. But the strange thing about it is no one is quite sure what its manifestations will be and how far it will reach and how it will affect our country. We just know that it has the potential to exert enormous influence. And how that sorts out is anybody's guess. Congress is very concerned about it. They fear that when EPA starts regulating these GHGs under the Clean Air Act, they are going to impose things like cap and trade or a carbon tax that will effect major changes in our ability to make money and compete on the world market. Can't have that given the situation with our economy and our competitive position in the world. So I'm afraid Congress will take the easy way out and just overturn the case. It's a real opportunity, though, to do what we've never done before, and that's to pass actual tailored legislation that tackles greenhouse gases in its own right, rather than as an adjunct to the Clean Air Act. Frankly, the Clean Air Act is not a good fit for regulating greenhouse gases. We need a tailored statute, and I hope Congress takes that option. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I guess it strikes me as odd that to talk about needing a crazy guy who doesn't care about money as part of a free market solution to environmentalism. I think that seems pretty contradictory.
It's not that he's a free marketeer or she. It's just that they are not subsidized by the government. They probably aren't a government employee, although I worked with several crazy government employees in my Air Force career. It's just somebody who's got a garage or a basement, and he or she's working away every day, studying things, trying crazy ideas, and one of these days they get lucky. And if they really don't care about money, they make the breakthrough. And Alexander Fleming wasn't a crackpot, but he by accident discovered penicillin and the antibiotic properties of that very humble species. It's the precursor to the biggest medical advancement of the 20th century. And serendipity is a very powerful force when it comes to scientific endeavor. You can't just direct these things. People say, well, the Manhattan Project, where we got a bunch of our best physicists together and we came up with atomic weapons during the latter phases of the World War II, shows we can do it. Yes, if you view that as a good thing, we did it then. But remember the pressures they were under. Talk about incentives. The situation was, can we get to the ultimate weapon before Hitler and his physicists? Guys like Werner Heisenberg, world-class geniuses. Can we get there first? Because if we don't, can you imagine Hitler gets atomic weapons first? That's what I call an incentive. And we did it. We did it. Very few other examples. And so the cupboard's largely bare when it comes to these kind of fundamental breakthroughs. Very poor record of government being responsible for it. Largely it happens outside of big business and government once in a while, maybe once a century. These are very rare events, but they are truly game changers. You study the biggest breakthroughs of all time. they're awe-inspiring in their magnitude, their inventiveness, the way they completely change the rules. Talk about shifting a few paradigms. And it's not because some government program threw money at a problem and said, well, it's going to be coming from biofuels. It just happens on its own because of people working hard on something they find is a passion of theirs. Anyone else? No one wants to talk about the Cubs. Believe me, there's a lot of leadership lessons to be learned from a century of failure as a Chicago Cubs baseball. Anyone else?
Well, yeah, before we take the last question, I'd like to take the time to thank our co-sponsors, Environmental Law Society and American Constitution Society. I don't know if anyone is here. Sure. So, now we can move on to cups.
Oh, no, you don't have to. I just being a wise guy. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much.
Stopping that,